All right, so our next speaker is somebody I've had the pleasure of knowing for quite some time, somebody I greatly admire. Rachel Andrew is the content lead for Chrome Developer Relations at Google, has also spent a considerable amount of time helping make the web that we use every day. We would not have Grid without her and her efforts. There are so many other things that I could say about what she has contributed to this industry, but 22 books? Chronic overachiever. That's really the best way I can describe her. Because it extends that to, I don't know, you're actually the second person that I know that has a pilot license here amongst the speakers. Okay, well, she still flies things. But anyway, I'm going to have Rachel come on up here and talk to you about new things coming in CSS, because she is the definitive source. Please welcome Rachel Andrew, everybody.
Thank you. Hello. You wouldn't believe this. I'm just looking at my computer and Google has logged me out. So let me just get back into it. There we go. Corporate computers, eh? So yes, I'm Rachel Andrew. So these days I work for Google as the content lead for Chrome. So I run a team of writers that publish to web.dev and developer.chrome.com. So if you ever go to one of those sites, it's me and my team who look after that content there. I'm also a CSS working group member, and I've been doing this web thing since before CSS was a thing. Luckily, I still find it quite interesting. And really that's because of this. It's a really, really exciting time to be a front-end developer. I'm kind of, I guess, sort of at the coalface of this because I get to find out about this stuff. I sometimes get to work on it. And the pace of things that are landing on the platform at the moment is amazing. And some of the problems that have actually plagued developers since the start of doing web development are being solved. So really, this is some of the features that have landed across all major engines since 2022. Now, I'm not going to read out all of those because it would take a while, but it's an awful lot of things. So there's just a massive amount of stuff, and some of these features are huge, have been landing on the platform. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, Google person, is this all Chrome only? But not at all. All of those things are interoperable and work across all of the major browser engines. None of those things are a single browser API or feature. And there's really been a big drive recently to get things implemented cross-browser. So we've got things like the Interop project. Now this project brings together representatives of all of the main browsers, along with other people who implement features in browsers, such as the company Agalia. So every year since 2022, this group has got together, created a list of top features and pain points, helped by proposals that come in from the community, and then spent the year working to land code that makes the features interoperable, makes them work everywhere. So these are the features that have been worked on in 2024. And this is the current dashboard. This is for the stable versions of browsers. If you actually switch it to experimental versions, you'll find that we're very, very close to done. And progress here is tracked using web platform tests. So it's an accurate reflection of what works in browsers, how well each browser is doing against the selected features each year. We've just finished the selection process for 2025. They call for proposals for the selection process. So now we'll go into a process where the browsers look at all the different proposals, figure out which ones are actually feasible. And early next year, in 2025, we will announce the list for Interop 2025. This is something that's ongoing. And it's helped to make several key features interoperable. So looking at my list of 2023 and 24 features, many of those features were part of the Interop project and now work across browsers. So this has been hugely impactful. Things that people really, really wanted are now working everywhere. But this really raises another question. How is anyone supposed to keep up with all of this stuff? And how do you know if things are available and ready to use? How quickly can we even start to use them? You know, once something is available in all browsers, how quickly can you start to use that? How quickly can you start to put that into projects? Now, I was a web developer for a very long time. I don't really build production websites anymore. I kind of talk about it. But you know, in the past, what we'd do is we'd go around feature by feature. You'd look at can I use? You'd go to the property pages on MDN. You know, is this thing available? Does it work? Very time consuming, and also everyone in the team has to do it. You're constantly checking, do things work? You know, am I going to have problems if I use this thing? It's really error prone. Particularly in CSS, we get a lot of what we call partial implementations. For example, the gap property worked for a long time in Grid, but not in Flexbox. So if you looked at gap, you might think, well, that should work everywhere, and then find it doesn't, and that's quite frustrating. It's not always clear to everyone on the team. And the other thing is, which browser version something shipped in is now pretty meaningless. Can anyone remember which version of Chrome Subgrid shipped in? Apparently it was Chrome 117. That was just over a year ago in September 2023. And Popover. When did that land in Firefox? Anyone know? It was 125, which was April this year. But really, you know, we don't know. Actually, one of the things I like to ask developers is, you know, which version of Chrome you're using? And they look at me blankly. No one knows which version of Chrome they're using. I mean, I probably would struggle to tell you, and I work on Chrome. We all have to look it up. In the past, we used to tie support to the version of Internet Explorer that we were stuck with. That was kind of where you went. You're like, oh, it's got to work in IE6, it's got to work in IE7, it's got to work in IE10. That kind of gave us a version of the web almost, because it was, you know, we couldn't move on because of the particular version of IE. But these days, you know, every browser has multiple releases per year. So you're doing pretty well if you remember which year a feature landed in. So it's not a new problem, but we're sort of seeing this at Chrome. You know, we survey developers, we talk to developers, and it's always the top problem that comes back. As I say, it's been made worse by the fact we've got this rapid cycle of releases with kind of meaningless version numbers. And we don't have, you know, the version of the web that IE gave us, because the web is now pretty evergreen, and we're shipping things so quickly. So over the past 3 years, we've been kind of trying to come up with a way to make things clearer for developers. And that work led us to the project we announced just over a year ago, Baseline. And we intend this really to be a way to version the web. Because what Baseline is going to give you is a way to see all of the features that are available to use as a group. We've kind of done this by creating 2 lines. There's 2 main lines described for Baseline, the first being newly available and the second being widely available. So what's newly available? That's really what I've kind of shown you already. It's the point of interoperability. A feature becomes newly available on the day that the last browser of our core browser set releases a stable version that supports it. So the core browser set is, you know, Apple Safari, both on the Mac and iOS, Google Chrome desktop and Android, Microsoft Edge, and Mozilla Firefox desktop and Android. So as soon as a feature is in all of those things, it's Baseline newly available. Now, I don't know about you, but most developers aren't happy to start using something the minute it is available cross-browser, because we've got browsers that are based on Chromium but aren't based on the latest Chromium. You've got people tied to old versions of browsers. It's not as bad as it used to be with IE, but you still get, particularly with mobile devices and things, people on older browsers. So there's, you know, you're not quite ready to use it often. So we had a look at this and we spoke to a lot of people and worked with our partners to kind of figure out, well, when are people happy to use a feature? And that really ranges, and it ranges across the globe. Obviously, there are different things that people worry about in different parts of the world. The line that we came up with for widely available is 30 months after the feature became newly available. That kind of gives time for a lot of the upgrading to happen. That means that most people have actually got access to the feature. So we call that Baseline widely available, a line at which you probably are pretty safe to use that feature unless you know something very specific about your audience. There is a third status, limited availability, which is features that have not yet landed newly available. So something that's Chrome only, something that's Safari only, that would be classed as limited availability. So then if we have a look at the features I started with, by baseline version. Because that list started in 2022, we've got a very few widely available features like cascade layers and dialogue, which you should feel pretty happy to use. They've got excellent browser support. I was actually quite surprised by this. Cascade layers seem pretty new to me, but actually it's just become widely available because it was launched, I think, in March of 2022. So it's been around for a fair amount of time. Now, of course, these are all the newly available features. They're everything else that has been launched that's newly available but hasn't yet become widely available. Some of the older ones at the top of that list will start moving into widely available. Now, before I kind of move on, I want to talk about governance, because this isn't just a Chrome thing. It was initiated by us. It came out of the work that we've done talking to developers and this kind of understanding that as we're chucking stuff into the web platform, we also need to make sure that people can use it and they feel happy using it. But we realized that for Baseline to be a thing, it had to not just be a Google thing. It had to be outside of us. We wanted to move it into the community. So that's what we did. We moved it into the community with the WebDX community group. It's a W3C community group, Web Developer Experience community group, shortened to WebDX. And it's this group that decided on that 30-month line. It's where the work to identify which features belong in Baseline is happening. And so it's been supported by Google, initiated by Google, but more and more that work is being moved out into this community group, which has representatives from all the browser vendors and also anybody who wants to be involved, because it's a W3C community group. Anyone can get involved with that and add their input. So we've got various developers and interested people very quickly got involved and helped to inform it, which is brilliant. So if you've looked at this group of newly available features, and you might think, yeah, widely available, that's a good line to tie to, and I'll explain a bit how you might want to use that later. The other thing you can do is you can think of the web platform as a yearly release, which we've never been able to do before. You can look at what's in Baseline by year. So that gives us this sort of new view of the web platform. I'll explain the data about this later, but let's have a little look at what we've got available. It's likely there's actually more features than I'm showing here, because we're sort of a good way through identifying everything. We've got a bit of work still to do. So these are the things that became newly available in 2022. So really anything that came before and anything that became newly available in 2022 could be seen as Baseline 2022. A lot of these things are widely available or becoming so. And this is 2023 new features. So anything that came before and these features could be classed as Baseline 2023. And this is 2024 so far. We expect there'll be a few things will become Baseline in the last couple of browser releases for the year. So this is pretty cool. It gives us a real view of the web platform every year and how it's changing. What's the diff? What's the difference between 2023 and 2024? And the nice thing about this is that each of these features, every time we launch something new, every time something new becomes Baseline, it solves a bunch of problems for developers. Someone will say, oh, that's the thing I've been waiting for. And so I kind of wanted to have a look at some of these features that have recently become newly available, because there's some pretty cool stuff in there. Now, I wanted to start with this because everyone knows that the hardest thing to do in CSS is to vertically center an item. Thankfully, not anymore. The problem was solved by Flexbox to some extent with the introduction of the alignment properties. So you can turn your parent into a Flex container. You can use align content to center the item. Now, it's a little bit weird if you have to make a Flex container to center something. Most of the time, it works fine. You can occasionally have some unwanted side effects. Now, when that was spec'd, it was spec'd to work for block layout, so for things that aren't Flex or grid containers. And that has now been implemented. So you don't need to turn things into a Flex or grid container. You can just say align content center and center your thing. That is now newly available. And so that's in all of our core browser sets. All of my examples are also on CodePen, and I'll share a link to everything and these slides at the end of the talk. So CSS custom properties, incredibly useful. They're widely available, the basic custom properties. The problem with basic custom properties is there's no ability to check that the value you've used makes sense in where you use the property. You can't set default values. So @property essentially lets you give a type to your custom properties and do things like set an initial value and inheritance. You can kind of make it more like a real part of CSS. So if you want to define a custom property, you use @property, and then you give your custom property a name. You then define its syntax. So in this case, I'm using color. Now that means that the only valid value for this property is some kind of color, some valid CSS color. I don't want it to inherit. I'm also going to give it an initial value. So in this case, I'm giving it a bright pink. So if you just use that property like you would a normal CSS custom property or variable, then it uses the initial value. So that is exactly that as if you've just used normal custom properties. You can redefine it, and if you use a valid color, it will then be used instead of the initial value. But where it gets interesting is if you try and use something else, or someone in your team tries to redefine that background color with an integer, for example. In that case, the value is ignored, but the initial value will be used instead. Now, with a regular custom property, if you have a property and you stick a number in something that should be holding a color, you'll just get no color. The whole thing will get thrown away. These @property, it lets you do some other interesting things. You can use them to animate gradients. There's a really nice example in this post on web.dev by Una Kravitz showing how you can animate a gradient by using @property. On web.dev, we have a series of posts, and we'll be adding some more celebrating features that are coming to baseline. So that's somewhere to look if you want to see the new things that are becoming baseline newly available. We try and get posts out for some of the key features with some examples. And then we have sized container queries. Again, also newly available. This was kind of like the top feature. I did a bit of digging back at one point and found that people started asking for container or element queries a few months after responsive design became a thing. I think there's been a bunch of sort of research into that done. You know, people were like, hang on, we don't want to just look at the viewport, we want to look at the container things that are in. Especially with component-driven design, you don't necessarily know where in your layout your thing is going to be. So container queries is something that people really, really wanted for a very long time. So we have simple things like this. You know, a card component you want to lay out when there's not a lot of room, you want it to be laid out this way. And then if you've got more space, you want to lay it out in a different way. And that could be the same component. It's not really the case of it being the viewport. It's, well, what if you put it in the sidebar and there's not a lot of space? So to use sized container queries, that container, the thing that your components go into, needs to be identified as a container. So here I've just got a div with a class of wrapper. Once you've got a container, you can query it just like you use media queries, except you're using @container. Now, as I say, container queries make component-based design so much easier. And there's another feature that's also newly available that I think works so nicely with container queries to make component-driven design easier, and that's has. And again, has solved one of the problems that kind of kept coming up. You know, you'd ask developers, what do you want? And they'd say, we want a parent selector. We'd like to be able to style things based, you know, style a component based on what's inside it. Now, has can actually do an awful lot more than be a parent selector. And I'll sort of share some things in my resources, but the parent selector ability is, again, brilliant for component-driven design, because now you can have a single component that responds to what's inside it and does different things. So couple that with container queries, and you've got components that can respond to external factors, how much space they've got, and internal factors, what's inside them. So if we take our previous example, what happens if that example doesn't always include a figure? So sometimes only text ends up in. You know, you've got a content management system and people put in random things. Sometimes they don't include the figure. If we used our previous example, what would happen with the text is it would end up in the first column of the grid. We'd go to the 2-column layout, the text would end up in the first column, leaving a gap. What we actually want there is we just want that to display across the whole thing. So as well as checking how much space we've got, we can check if the card container has a figure using has. So now the component only goes to 2 columns when there's enough space to lay it out in 2 columns, and it has the figure and the content. And then this is a little feature that I really love because it's a nice progressive enhancement. On the web, we've never really been able to control things like sort of orphans and widows, and when you end up with like one word stuck on the end of a line. In print, you tweak that. You can't do it on the web. Well, you actually can now, or you can let the browser do it for you. With just a line of CSS, text wrap balance, CSS will have a go at balancing your headings and other short pieces of text. Lovely progressive enhancement because if it's not there, people will get what they had before. If they have the feature, it's going to look a bit nicer with the headings. I think most people should add those to their short headings. It really does make a difference. And then also newly available is all of this color work that's been happening. We're moving away from just having sRGB, standard red, green, and blue color spaces, to having a whole bunch of new color spaces that essentially support high-definition displays. There's 12 new color spaces in the level 4 specification. There's also a bunch of functions. The color function lets you access RGB color spaces. The other functions, things like LCH and so on, let you access all of these other color spaces. This could be an entire talk of its own. In my resources, there's a bunch of stuff from my colleague Adam Argyle, who's done a lot of work with the CSS color specs and some really nice things, as well as his gradient.style, which lets you create some pretty gradients and play around with the new color spaces in CSS. So definitely have a look at those. And just to wrap up with the features, also for color, we've got the color mix function that is now newly available. It brings to CSS something you might have used in a preprocessor, the ability to mix one color into another. This supports all of the new color spaces as well as all of your traditional ones. So the first parameter indicates the color space, then the color you want to mix in, and the percentage to use, and then the color it gets mixed into. So you can do things like this, mixing increasing amounts of blue into white. So this is great for creating things like color schemes in CSS. So all of those things and many, many more are available. But, well, how would you know? How do you know what's there? How do we know what's there? How are we sort of figuring out what actually is available? Now, the reason we didn't have this view of the web platform before is that the data did not exist. There was no way to actually say how many features were fully available across browsers. We had these sort of granular, broken down views, but nothing that told you feature by feature. So behind the scenes is a project, the Web Features Work, which is also happening in the WebDX community group. It's basically mapping the entire web platform as a set of features, which turns out to be pretty hard, because some features include CSS, JavaScript, and HTML to actually make the full thing work. How it works is there's a GitHub repo, and it's relying on the browser compat data that shows the status of individual CSS properties or JavaScript methods and so on. So if you look at an individual feature file, you'll see all of the BCD keys. So they map right back to the key used on MDN for the browser compat data. So the big red arrow here is pointing to grid auto flow. Now, if you went to MDN, that would show up on the grid auto flow page in the compat data, as has been happening for years. But if you scroll up to the top of the page, you'll now also find the baseline status. You can see that it's widely available. That feature is deemed widely available. So this is letting us show in an automated way what is in baseline, based on an existing data project that's kept up to date with new browser releases. This data is going to be really, really useful, which kind of leads me on to what people might want to do with baseline. So very simply, the first thing I think that most people are thinking, well, this is a great way to explain browser support to stakeholders. They might be your clients, they might be your team, your boss, internal stakeholders, whoever. People don't understand browser versions. And also, if you tie your support to a browser version, you essentially kind of lock your project into the past because the web moves on, things become available, and you might add a feature to the project and then have to kind of like renegotiate which browser version you want to stick with. If you go with widely available, that line is always moving. So if you come back to the project a year later and you say, we're going to adopt widely available, you've got new features available to you. You don't have to get buy-in for minimum supported versions. We've already seen people doing this. The UK web agency ClearLeft has adopted baseline in their client browser support statement, so you can see that. The other thing I think is going to be quite useful, I used to be a content management system vendor, and when you've got, say, an admin panel, you need to make sure that the people who use your CMS understand whether it's going to work for their users. So people who are actually logging into the admin panel, is it going to work? I think that the baseline years are going to be super useful for projects. Because if you have a JavaScript framework, a CMS, something where you want to say, this version of the product has this level of browser support, being able to say, version 2 of my project, we support everything that's in baseline 2022. And then you ship a new version of your project. At that point, you could say, okay, our users have moved on, we'll move to the next version. So very, very clear what you're supporting. And that'd be quite useful because there are things for where having a fixed line sort of encoded into your support statement is quite useful. As developers, baseline can show you what's new and interoperable because we can say, hey, these are the things that landed this year. Maybe you'd like to learn about them. I always say to people who are saying, I can't keep up, you don't need to learn about everything that lands, but it is handy to know what has landed and what problems it solves. So that when you come up against a problem, you're like, oh, there was that thing that I heard about at a conference, and then you go and learn more about it. So I think actually looking at what's landed in a year can be pretty useful for that. It can help you to identify things to learn about. We've got ways to look at that. The Web Features Explorer is based on the Web Features data, so you can have a look and you can see what has landed in different years, what's widely available. We've got the Web Status Dashboard, which we're working on with people from the Chrome team. We've got sort of various things that we're hoping to land in this to help to expose the status of things that are coming into baseline. Something else that I think is really helpful, as someone who essentially works on developer content these days, being able to show feature status clearly is really important. I think most of us have had that thing where we're reading an article thinking, oh, great, this solves my problem. Then you get to the bottom and they'll say, it's Chrome only. And that's just rubbish. So it was something I always ask people to do, when I'm editing content, is make sure you put the browser information right at the top. Tell people where this works before you get them excited about it. So this is something that we can do with baseline. We've created a component that anyone can use, either as an NPM module or as just an embedded thing from a CDN. We've started to put it onto web.dev. So you can see there the font size adjust, saying that it's baseline newly available. That's also hosted with the WebDX group. So you can grab that with NPM or include the CDN version. And then once it's installed, you basically add it by just adding the tag with the feature ID from the web features repo. And obviously that will then keep up to date as the feature moves from newly to widely available. And it helps readers understand what the status is. So that's available for anyone to start using now. And also the logos. They've been licensed for anyone to use, so you can use them on slides like I've done in this talk. To show status of features. As I say, they're all licensed to use, and there's an explanation of how you can sort of use those. If anyone does use baseline anywhere, we'd love to hear about it, because obviously this is a fairly new thing. We've really just starting to get the data to a shape where it's useful for everybody. And so we'd love people to make a PR. If you use baseline somewhere, if you mention it in an article, let us know, because we'd love to see what people are doing and get sort of feedback. But the final thing that I think is really exciting is we've got this data set and we're getting it to a state where we can really run with it in tooling. So what if you could include the baseline that you support in your linter or in an action that runs over a pull request? Rather than everyone needing to check whether the things you're using are going to work, you can let your tooling do it for you. RUM Archive have already started to implement this. They show how many users are included based on their data for each baseline year. So that can help you choose which baseline year works for you. If you don't want to simply adopt widely available, you can have a look at actually, how many users. And we're expecting to have some things launched very soon that will help you assess whether your users, where they kind of fall, the actual users of your own site. I think that the tooling part of this is really excited. I'd love to hear from anyone who's got an idea for where we could be incorporating baseline. And the whole team are very happy to sort of work with people and to sort of get ideas for what would be useful. Because I think this is something, as we get the data into a good shape, this is, to me, the most exciting thing, because where we can actually just have tools running that tell you whether the stuff you're using is actually going to work for people. So I'm really excited about Baseline, and I think, as I've been talking to developers about it, I've had heard really great comments, and people can see the value. I hope it's going to help people better navigate the exciting time we live in for web developers, and take advantage of all of the new things that are landing across browsers. As I say, if you want to get involved, you can get involved with the WebDX community group, you can add Baseline information to your site, you can integrate with developer tools, and if you want any help with that, please talk to me, or get involved with the community group, because I'd be really, really happy to help make that happen. And all of this information is available there. Thank you very much for listening.
Rachel, thank you as always. Have a seat. We certainly have no shortage of questions coming
excellent.
in already. My favorite bit was questioning, like, you, Google person, is this actually interoperable? But gosh, where do we start? All right, so let me look at some of the questions that are coming in. Why 30 months?
So there was a lot of debate about this, and if you get a bunch of people who work on different browsers, you can imagine the amount of debate there was. And it really was just, as I say, when we talk to developers, often people say, oh, the last 2 versions, but of course that's only 2 months. But as you dig into it, then people are like, oh yes, but then versions of, say, iOS, Safari, on iOS, and people get trapped on a version of Chrome on Android, perhaps. So really, it was looking at that data across, lots of different places, different countries, places across the world where people maybe aren't upgrading as quickly. And that seemed like a very good line. That was the point at which, unless you know something special about your audience, unless you know that, there's this enormous enterprise that we target who are refusing to let everybody upgrade from an ancient version of something, it's probably going to be okay. That was a good line, and it seemed... It's more conservative than a lot of people we talk to, which I think is probably a good thing, because we typically end up talking to developers from, who are sort of from Western nations with good technology, and actually once you get sort of a bit more broadly out into the world, you realize that's not always the case. So it was the best line. Every line is going to be wrong, and that's why, I think sometimes, adopting a year might be better for some people. But yeah, we had to pick a line somewhere, and that seemed to be the best. At that point, you can generally pretty safely use things unless you know something else.
So that actually brings up one of the other questions, which is around the idea of, the first thing that I would gravitate to is progressive enhancement. So like text wrap balance, that's a wonderful one-liner to throw in there, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. That's fine. But what about going a little bit further with things like polyfills? What are your thoughts there?
Right, so when we originally started this, we had kind of thought we might have a line that includes polyfills. When we started to look at polyfills and define what a gold standard polyfill was, we realized there weren't any, or there were very few, because most polyfills require that you kind of work around them very carefully. So for instance, you could write a polyfill for container queries. You wouldn't want to use it all over your site because it would just tank your performance. So we kind of backed away from that. What I think with the newly available line is you can see that as it reduces the number of things that you might want to consider as a progressive enhancement or to polyfill. So you can say, well, actually, I'm going to start looking at newly available things, but I'm only going to use them if I know that there's a good fallback. So say something like text wrap balance, yeah, you can use that, that's fine. Container queries, maybe not. It depends on how you're going to use it. It might be you can use it as a progressive enhancement. You might be able to do a polyfill. There are ways to polyfill it, but you need to take a bit of care. There's actually an article on web.dev about how you could create a sort of polyfill for container queries. So, do check that out. So I think what it does is it reduces the number of things you need to care about. If it's in widely available, don't worry about it. You should probably just be able to use that. If it's a newly available thing, you may well be able to use it. You probably can. Lots of us are using these things, but just take a bit more care when you do it. And so, yeah, I think that's a help in itself. Just there are fewer things you need to be sort of worrying about doing that with.
And speaking of what you were describing about where this data can be useful, has there been any work in helping incorporate it into like a build tool chain, perhaps, to just give you a report on your project to see how baseline compatible it is.
Yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing we'd love to see happen. And we've been sort of talking to people. It really has been that we've had to get the data to a point where there's enough of it to be able to do that, and that has been far harder than any of us imagined. By the end of the year, we should be pretty much there. But it has been a huge... once it's all there, once we've mapped the platform, then adding new stuff isn't that hard. It's just getting, like div, float, all of the stuff that's there, that's been there forever, we do still need to map. So, yeah, and once we've got that, build chains, all of that stuff, I think it'll be really great just to be able to have that stuff running automatically.
And so how about the other browsers built on various engines? So is this taking into consideration Opera, Brave, any of the other browsers that are poking up here and there?
Right, so most of these things are based on Chromium. It's actually really difficult to find out which version of Chromium things are on, and that was part of the reason behind the 30 months, because a lot of these things, obviously Edge is always up to date with Chrome. It's built on the same version of Chromium when they release, but not everything is. And it's actually quite difficult to uncover exactly what they're on. So again, that's another reason for the 30 months thing, is to make sure that any Chromium-based browsers, or anything else-based browsers for that matter, have been built from a version which includes the feature. Because that's not always something that we all know and say it's hard to find out.
So this next question is sort of an extension of, I have been fortunate enough to be speaking at a number of conferences over the years where you are. Whenever I'm at a conference where you and or Jen Simmons are speaking, I know I'm going to learn what's next on the web. For everybody else, as we go like back into our own orgs and our own communities, what's the best way in your mind about how to sort of propagate this knowledge? How do we kind of evangelize this within our own communities as we find these things and want to popularize them?
For a long time I was kind of like CSS Grid's unofficial DevRel. I actually work within a DevRel team now, and I think a lot of it is when you find things that you think, yes, this will solve my problems, and I'd like to tell other people about it. And that's what I've always done. When I saw CSS Grid, I was like, this is what I've been waiting for, and I don't want it to go away, so I'm going to start telling people about it. And I think that's what it is, but there's that enthusiasm about stuff. That enthusiasm about what we do and making it better. And I think that is very compelling, when people say, hey, look, I found this thing and it's really cool. Look at it. Look at what it does. And that's all I've ever done, because as I said at the start, I've been doing this for a very long time, sort of over 25 years. And I still look at something, an engineer at Chrome will say, oh, have you seen this that we're working on? I'm like, wow, everyone's been waiting for that for ages, and I'm still excited by it. And I think that excitement about the job that we do, just, it brings people along. People are like, oh, right, I hadn't thought about that, and we'll have a look. So I think enthusiastic people about the work it actually does share, it helps to share things. Because at the very least, people will go, well, why are they excited about that? Maybe it's worth a look,
As anyone who's ever heard me talk about variable fonts, I relate.
Yeah.
So one of the other questions in here was really just about what it's taken to make baseline happen. I mean, in terms of like the effort that you've had to put in to coordinate this effort to have it not just be a Google thing. Maybe just talk a little bit about the collaboration amongst the different browser vendors.
Yeah, I think like the Interop project as well, we do have these points that we all work together, and any standards development is a collaboration. So, the CSS working group is full of people from all of the different vendors, and we work together. It's a lot of collaboration, and we have to slow down. I think, if we just said, right, we're going to do this as Chrome, we would have probably landed it much earlier than we did, because if you go alone, you can just be like, right, we're going to ship this, we're going to get on with it, and we think it's a good idea. To take a step back and say, no, we're going to wait, until we've spoken to people and we've got some buy-in, at least some interest, or at least not an objection. You know, it's like, you know, because it can take a while. And I think that's the thing is that the team working on this have been willing to take that step back and incorporate other ideas and not just forge ahead. And I think that for any work like this with interoperability, you have to take things at their pace rather than, you know, think, oh, I'm going to ship this to meet my OKRs this month. It's probably not going to happen. So I think that's it. It's that patience and the willingness to listen and negotiate.
Well, stepping back from that level of being impartial, be really partial. Tell us what is an upcoming CSS feature that's got you really excited.
Well, for a very long time, I have worried about CSS grid and reading order. So basically this problem where if you position things with CSS grid, you can take them out of the natural tab order. So you can end up jumping all over the place very, very easily. You know, line-based positioning, you can completely jumble up. And then if you try and tab around, you'll be like doing all sorts of disconnected things. I have felt this was a problem since CSS Grid shipped, and since before it shipped, I've been going on about this. We are very, very close to having a solution to that with a property called Reading Flow, which is currently behind an experimental flag in Chrome. It's going through the CSS working group process. I've sort of written the spec for it, and we've got a Chrome engineer working on it. And that will basically let you say, I'm in CSS Grid, I've jumbled up the order for whatever reason, please follow the visual order, follow the flow, rather than follow the DOM order. So if you are interested in that, there's stuff on developers.chrome.com about that. It's behind a flag at the moment. So yes, that's what I'm excited about, because I think that is a big problem, and if we can solve that, I'll be very, very pleased.
Is it, it makes me think about regions. Is that sort of like that ability to kind of connect things that...
Not so much. It's more just you've got your layout, you've jumbled it up from how it is in the source, and you want to follow what it is visually, because there's an awful lot of people both tabbing around the document, but also people using screen readers who can see, which is a big usage. You know, there's a lot. It's not everyone is using a screen reader and can't see. It's sort of you're using the exact same layout you were using, but you're just fixing that tab problem. And yeah, so it really is just making grid more useful, because at the moment we have to tell people not to do it. You know, if we say don't jumble up the layout because it's going to make it difficult for people who are keyboard navigating. So actually it would unlock a lot of things that you can do with grid, but at the moment we tell people not to do for accessibility reasons if we can actually control this. So it actually, I think it'll make grid more useful to people once we get that landed. So I'm pretty excited about that, because it's something I've been trying to figure out how to solve for a long time, so it's exciting to get that done.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
As always, amazing. Good.